My name is Elise Gramza. For those of you that don't know me, I'm in the registrar's office.
I'm Matt Olafson from Equal Opportunity and General Counsel's office.
And we have developed this FERPA presentation, which you've already noticed we've titled Clear, Simple, and Fun, which are probably the last three words that you think of when you think of FERPA. But hopefully through the presentation today you'll learn something maybe new about FERPA that you didn't know, or enhance the knowledge that you already had and how it relates to our students at Ferris and how it relates to you as you interact with our students at Ferris. So we're going to go a little bit back and forth throughout the presentation, taking different subject areas. All right, we're going to get into the real deal now. Here's the first question. What does FERPA stand for?
Susan was just thinking about this.
The answer is A, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So you are good so far. You know the first part of FERPA, just what it stands for. So what is it really? It stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. It's a federal law to protect and give rights to students in regards to their educational records. It basically does, I think, basically three main categories of things. It gives a student the right to inspect their records or request to inspect their records. Gives them the right to request an amendment to those records if they think there's an inaccuracy to them. And it gives them, what kind of we're more familiar with, I think, is it gives them protection regarding the release of those educational records to a third party, let's say, when it's that personally identifiable information and non-directory level information. So those are kind of the first parts of FERPA. General information on the Family Compliance Office that you'd file, a student could file complaints with, could file a request for a hearing under FERPA. So that's some general information on kind of who is responsible for FERPA overall. At each institution, there is a FERPA compliance officer for Ferris, for those of you that don't know it. It's not me. That would be Dr. Solmonson. Kristen Solmonson, the Dean of Enrollment Services, is the FERPA compliance officer for Ferris State University. So usually things would start kind of through us in our office, not general counsel, through the registrar's office. When someone has a concern or a question, I take care of a lot of those first initial general questions that are pretty clear. If we have some sort of FERPA violation, that could get escalated up to Kristen, Dean Salmonson, and then potentially general counsel if need be too.
So why should you comply with FERPA? Well, as the representative from the General Counsel's office, I should tell you that it's always good to comply with the law, and FERPA is the law. So we, as an educational institution, want to be in compliance. Of course, there are consequences for not being in compliance, and one of those major consequences is that we can be disbarred from any federal funds, which includes the opportunity to receive student federal aid. So the consequence is pretty high. And lawsuits can just cost us in reputation and money. So administratively, it's not something that we want to deal with, and we shouldn't have to deal with as long as we're engaging with compliance. Another quiz question. The FERPA rights of a student begin, and the answers are A, when the application for admission is received, B, when the student is formally admitted, C, when the student pays his or her first tuition bill, or D, when the student is in attendance, as defined by the institution. The answer is actually D. We as an institution get to define a little bit about when attendance is, and that's what the law says. That's when the rights begin. In essence, the Act allows college students to view their own records, and it allows school officials to view those records when they have a legitimate educational interest or need. But it doesn't allow us to just disclose the personally identifiable information about students without some type of permission or need. Who is and not covered under FERPA? Well, students are covered when they're in attendance at the institution, and applicants who are denied admission or who have never attended are not covered.
Yeah, on the admissions side, we kind of, I don't want to say we pretend they're covered under FERPA, but we always like to work with the student. So if we have a student that is, pending, I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind, I'm jumping. Have a student that's kind of a pending application or got rejected, and a parent calls, we could tell them that information. We could share the information that we have regarding that student on file. But we kind of take the stance as really, one, if the student does become if the person does become a student at Ferris, they should probably get used to the idea that the parent's not going to be able to call and do all of their work for them. And two, just because they're not protected doesn't mean we need to be giving out all of their information. So we still like to say, let's talk to the student about this, because really they're the ones that should be getting that information directly. So when do they begin, when do the rights begin and end for FERPA? For Ferris, we consider that in attendance, defined by the institution, not admitted, not just admitted, not just registered for classes, not just came for orientation. First day of classes start, they're registered for a class, and they're sitting in a seat. That's when we consider FERPA starting. So throughout the summer, when they're registering, yes, they've got classes on their schedule, but as we've defined it as an institution, it's when they actually start classes, where they're in a seat. That's when FERPA starts for Ferris. And FERPA continues on after the student leaves. What I know of FERPA is that if a student is deceased, that is the point where FERPA ends for that particular student. So again, what I said earlier, the two things that I think are less known about FERPA, at least from my perspective, are the things that people I don't think necessarily think of. It gives them the right to inspect their record, and it gives them the right to request an amendment to that record if they feel there's an inaccuracy. Those are two lesser of the things that I see even on the student side, the student's concern. I don't have a lot of students coming to me saying, I want to request an amendment to my record. Sometimes I do get I want to inspect my educational record, and I have the right to, therefore, even though I owe a bill, you have to give me a transcript. There's some wiggle room there. If we can make accommodations for them to view their record on campus or one of our off-site campuses, no, we don't have to give you a transcript. You still owe money to the university. We're making accommodations for you to inspect the record. So we always do that. It doesn't necessarily give them the right to a transcript, though, in their hands. Next question, which of the following is not an education record? A student's traffic violation, B, a student's email address, C, the women's soccer team's roster showing hometown, height, weight, I don't want anyone knowing that of me, and the current class of team members, or D, work study student's work record. And the answer is A, a student's traffic violation.
Some athletic information we can release, so that's why it's a tricky question. But some athletic information you can't release, and this kind of goes into some details of that we wouldn't release. Class rosters and heights and weights, and just participation maybe we would release. And it's usually on the athletics website, the roster of who's on the team. But one of the carve-outs of HIPAA is criminal records, which we'll talk about in a second, and that would relate to traffic violations.
Going over some of the information, they could file the complaint with the U.S. Department of Education if they feel their rights have been violated. Those are the things that, again, in my time, I have not seen one of those complaints filed. If we know that some sort of, I'm going to say minor FERPA violation has occurred, we keep record of it, and then if we feel we need to notify the students, we do. You might remember probably 2007, 2008, a recruiter's laptop was stolen on the road. Potentially there could have been some FERPA information released, so we kind of offered up, hey, your information might have been on that laptop. It was encrypted, the chances of them actually accessing or using that information. So we kind of took the proactive measure there and did some notifications. The student has the right to, within FERPA, I think you're probably somewhat familiar with the kind of the two chunks of information, I'll call it, in regards to the student's record. There's what we call directory level information and personally identifiable information, and that's really hard for me to say, so I'm going to say non-directory level information. Directory level information being that information we could share with a third party if we needed to or wanted to, had someone request it. Non-directory level being everything else, everything that's kind of protected under FERPA. Students also have the right to, you'll see the last bullet there, even request that that directory level information be protected and not released. And I'm going to go into some more details about that in the non-disclosure part. So what are educational records? All of that, directory, non-directory, all records as they relate to the student that are maintained by the institution. This includes what we have, obviously, in extender and banner, any personal notes that a faculty or an advisor can make that are shared or are in, I'll say, a conspicuous place where they could be viewed would be considered part of that educational record. So these are the things that you kind of want to handle in that fashion, the things that are going to have that non-directory level information on it. Any registration forms, I don't know how many of us keep registration forms, but you might keep some check sheets that you're filling out paper-wise. Transcripts, any information viewed on your computer screen. When anyone ever does videos or screenshots and pictures on campus, I'm always looking. Okay, is any FERPA information in that? Because I think a lot of people, it's just really natural for them to have their computer screen up and no big deal. I think there was a poster over in the IRC of a student, like a full-length poster, and he's wearing a student ID, his Bulldog ID card. And right there was his student ID. So I think they took a Sharpie to it later, but I'm always looking for those types of things because I think those are the things that are very natural for us in our work environment, that we use that stuff, we see that stuff all the time, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to take steps to keep it protected and keep it safe. So class rosters, class assignments, any grades are all considered part of that student's record and all considered protected under FERPA.
What are not considered educational records? As I said, there's a carve-out for a few types of records that relate to students but are not considered education records, one of them being law enforcement records or criminal-related records. But there's an exception within that as well, because if the law enforcement record is maintained and utilized only for law enforcement purposes within the public safety or the police department, then it's not an education record. But if that law enforcement record is utilized, maybe say it goes to student conduct, it becomes an education record in terms of what we're keeping in student conduct. So we have to be careful that we can change the actual classification of the record from not an education record to an education record, depending on how it's used. The same for employment records. Employment, even if it's a student that is also an employee, the records related to their employment would not be student records unless for some reason they were commingled with some type of student disciplinary action, or if it was kind of work study or graduate assistant work, so that the work is only ancillary to them being a student. It's part of their studies. Medical records, similarly, any healthcare professionals, including counselors and psychologists, would not be education records unless they were commingled for some reason. And alumni records, so after the student has graduated, if they participate in any alumni events, that participation is not an education record. Additionally, personal notes are not considered educational records, and those are notes really just for your self-recollection or reminders. They're not notes that you would ever share with anyone, because if you share them or if you put them in an area where they're accessible to others, they become education records.
All right, next question. Directory information may include all of the following except the students. Now this one, when we were going over, we had discussion about even. So I feel like this is kind of tricky too.
It is tricky. And that's where the discussion was.
Yeah. The answer is D. So it may include all of the following, but not the country of citizenship. Now, at Ferris, in particular, we do consider the class schedule non-directory. But an institution has some leeway in what they consider directory, and that's one of the ones on the table. They could have a student's class schedule considered directory. They could have the major, which we do. They could have the photograph, which we do not, but they cannot have country of citizenship. So what information can be released? directory level information. So the best place, instead of rattling all of that off, the best place that I go to, or I tell people to go to when they're looking at what is directory level information, what can I share, and I'm going to go over some of it, is to go on to your MyFSU login page. Before you log in, there's a FERPA staff reference sheet. There's 2 columns, directory, non-directory. Directory level information, you're good to go. Non-directory level information, that's where, if you're in person, obviously if you're working with the student consistently, you know that that person's that person. If they're just walking into an office, you'd want to ask for maybe a photo ID. On the phone, you're going to have to start verifying some information with that student before you cross over into the non-directory level information. So a lot of times I work at it every day, I will pull up that staff reference sheet and look at when I'm actually on the phone with a student, because usually my interaction is on the phone, and know right from the get-go where that line is for the conversations that we're having with students. Non-directory level information can be released if the student has offered written consent to release that information. It could be, consent to send a transcript, all the way to, the student just one time wants to give someone permission to share their GPA with an honor society they're trying to apply for, or it goes to, again, all the way to the other side where they're giving written consent to continually give information to, let's say, a named parent. So when they do that FERPA release information. The information can be used and viewed by university officials that have legitimate educational interest, and also certain government agencies. That university official, it could be someone that has a contract with us to provide services. They are acting on behalf of the university, so they could have access to that information. If you think about the 24-hour TAC service, that's not taking place after hours on campus, but that is a company that has been hired. They have a contract with the university to act on behalf of the university, so they have access and can use some of that information. Again, the directory level information is that information that can be released without a student's written consent. And as we talked about with the first question, the university can, I want to say, pick and choose within some limitations what they consider directory level information. And these should be all of those things listed on that staff reference sheet as directory level information. Pretty straightforward. Some of the things that I think people get a little worried about is maybe an admit status or an enrollment status. Those things kind of seem protected or safe, or something you might not want to share with a third party. Just because we can doesn't mean we do. Like, again, that example that someone's not necessarily protected under FERPA yet, but I don't really want to tell a parent that Johnny Smith got rejected. Let's talk to Johnny Smith instead. Let's kind of get them used to the idea that if he ever gets into Ferris, he's going to be protected, and that information might be protected. So those pieces of information are considered directory. Any questions on those? Okay, usually people are pretty clear about those. This is one that I like to point out because a lot of these honors are academic and based on a GPA, which is considered protected. So when we publicize a dean's list, chances are we know, the dean's list is a certain GPA or higher. If we give the student summa cum laude as a distinction with their degree, we have an idea that their GPA is something or higher, but we are allowed to release that information. We are not releasing that student's specific GPA. We are just saying that they got this award, and this award may have some sort of GPA stipulation, so they would have to at least have that GPA or higher to get it. But we're not releasing that student's specific GPA, just the award related to it. A student can request that their information, even directory level information, be withheld to any third party. So typically, it's usually not a pretty situation where someone's calling in and saying, I don't want anyone to know anything about me as a student at Ferris. We've had, there happens to be maybe an ugly divorce or a bad roommate situation. I think the one recently was a bad roommate situation. So they can come in to here on main campus or one of our offsite locations if they happen to be away, and fill out a disclosure request with the picture ID. And basically what that does is it protects their directory level information. So us as an institution, we can't release that information. What that does for that student is it protects them, but it also is a slight inconvenience because it protects their information from them. Because if they call in and say, hey, I'm Jane Smith, I know I have that non-directory level information thing, but I really need help registering for this class. It's giving me this error. Can you help me out? A name is considered directory level information. So by looking up Jane Smith and saying, hey, Jane Smith, yeah, I see you have that non-directory level thing. I can't help you out. You have to come in person. By verifying that you see Jane Smith's name in there and that you're talking to her, you're verifying her name, and therefore she's a student at Ferris. So there's this lovely, this kind of goes over some of those things. There's this lovely saying, I don't know if it's on here or not, it doesn't look like it is, where if we type in that student's name, it comes up confidential. In IMB banner, it's a little more obvious. There's actually a pop-up box that comes up and says student information confidential or confidential information. In self-service banner, it doesn't slap you in the face. So you kind of have to be on a lookout for it. I think it's like up in the corner of the student's information that this person is confidential. If we ever get that, we don't even, I don't take a student ID ever when anyone calls. I always look them up by their name. So if I were to look up Jane Smith, see her, I would say nothing about, hey, I found you in here. I would say, if Jane Smith is a student at Ferris, she would have to come on campus to conduct any business, come in with a picture ID, I'd be happy to help you. Something along those lines. I have actually like a little blurb written out that I would basically continue to repeat to a student until I was blue in the face, because we've had that, I know, I filled it out, but continue, if that were the case, if you did fill that out, that would be something that you would need to come in with a picture ID and to conduct any business on campus. So it is inconvenient for the student. And the student I just talked to late last week was, I don't understand why I'm being punished for, this person is bothering me. I don't want them to have, why am I being inconvenienced? And I said, it is an inconvenience, but it's also guaranteeing that no one's going to have access to your information. It's a pain. Especially if you're an off-campus student, it's kind of a pain. You're going to have to come in with a picture ID. But again, it's usually cases, and this is what I told her, it's usually cases where it's really more important that your information be protected than you're inconvenienced. So it's your call. You can rescind it. You can go try it out for a semester. If it's not working out for you, come back in, written, okay, I want this off. We'll move forward from there. So it is a slight inconvenience for students, but usually it's well worth it. There is a web focus report. I don't know if any of you are aware of this. There's a web focus report that you can look up, I think by college, students with that confidential marker. So if you're getting ready for the semester and you have your advising load and you want to run that to see currently if any of your advisees kind of right from the start are going to have that signed, might not be a bad idea. They can have it signed at any time, and we don't go out and notify advisors or anybody else. So especially if you're using self-service banner, kind of watch out for it. There aren't a lot of students. There's probably 10, just guessing, on campus right now that may have this. There aren't a lot of students that do it, but it is pretty serious when they do. Not since I've been in the office, but when I was on the admission side, it was more common for some reason that we'd have people kind of testing the water, see if they could get through. And when they did, they were usually not very happy. And they were doing that on purpose. They were seeing if the system worked, that they signed this and that it worked. We don't have the ability to do, yes, your name can be, directory, but everything else can't be. It is literally, not much is a check mark in Banner. We always want a check mark in Banner to do something, and not much is except for this. It is literally a yes or a no. It's either all or nothing. So that's the option that we have for these students. So.
As Elise said, one of the areas where we can release non-directory information is amongst ourselves at the institution when we have a legitimate educational interest. So the question is, what is a legitimate educational interest according to FERPA? Is it A, a faculty member's need to provide feedback to students in the form of grades or evaluations? B, the registrar's need to obtain education record information from faculty to produce a student transcript? C, a school official's right to obtain information only about students he or she is advising or teaching during the current year? Or D, a school official's need to review student education record information to fulfill a responsibility as part of his or her contract? The answer is D, because D is the broadest one. And so a registrar may have the need to obtain an education record from a faculty to fill in the student transcript. That's correct. But how does FERPA define legitimate educational interest? It defines it as having a professional responsibility. So you see the word responsibility in the fourth one. That's kind of your cue that that's coming from the law. So any individual within our campus, faculty, staff, or administrator who has a professional responsibility that has to do with a student record has a legitimate educational interest in that record. So who can access that information? As I said, faculty, staff, or other officials. You know, Elise said earlier, someone who has a contract to perform work on the university's campus or to do work for us could have a legitimate educational interest in receiving some of those records. A designated university official is another key term that comes from FERPA. It's talking about a person at the university in pretty much any capacity, administrative, supervisory, academic, even support, that has that legitimate educational interest. For our purposes, the Board of Trustees, a person who has a contract or a company that has a contract is also going to have a legitimate educational interest. Temporary employees, affiliates, student workers may have a legitimate educational interest to some records, right? And remember that the interest is not to all records. It's not just to any record that you want, but it's to the particular record that's needed for that responsibility. So a legitimate educational interest is to perform that specific task, as I said. And that task could be for an administrative purpose. If for my purposes, looking at history in terms of complaint resolution or remediation of issues. It could be an academic administrative task, or it could be any task that we really do for the benefit of the student.
So again, who else can access that student information? Obviously, the individual student, the student in question, or that student, whoever that student designates as being able to have that information. Again, that signed release. And we usually, I'm really specific when I ask a student to sign a release. I want you to tell me exactly what. Don't just say, you know, things that pertain to my class schedule. What semester and or semesters? How much detail do you want? Do you want just the class, you know, subject and title? I mean, the credit hours. What exactly do you want me to say? Because they can mean one thing, and I could interpret it very different. So I'm usually very specific about what am I giving this third party. Obviously, any party could have or get the information of a student that's directory level, unless they have that non-disclosure form filled out on their record. And then, again, any official for Ferris University that has that legitimate educational interest. Parents' rights. They can get directory level information just like anybody. And then if a student wants their parent to have continual access to GPA, individual grades, financial records, billing, they can come in, they can sign a release saying, I want this named person and this named person to have access to, again, very specific, just my GPA, my GPA and grades, my GPA and billing. They actually have very specific kind of categories of information that they designate that person be willing to get. They might just say, nothing with GPA, nothing with grades, but they can do my billing for me for that parent that I paid the bill. And that information is in comments or Space Mountain, and as well as the actual document that the student signs is on extender. So if usually a parent knows, the first thing out of their mouths will be, hey, my son or daughter filled out that thing where you can talk to me. So I'll go out to Space Mountain and figure out, okay, who am I talking to? Yep, you're Diane, you're listed on here. But gee, you're just listed as financial aid information. So if you have a question on billing, I'll send you down to business operations. If you got a question on, you know, your student's grades, you're gonna have a discussion with the student instead of me, unless the student wants to designate that. If it's the parent, and yes, they have the release, I can talk to anything about them. I usually draw kind of a line where I'm not going to list off every class that a student has taken and the grade that they've gotten. If they're asking for really detailed, specific information and lots of it, just because I can release it to them doesn't mean I'm going to sit there and spend the time going through the student's entire transcript with them. I say, have your son or daughter order a transcript or have them pull up an unofficial transcript. for you so you can view that. Yeah, curiosity, not a reason, not a good reason to access. It really should be, you might have access, especially using self-service banner, you might have access to all of that information, but really you need to be working with the students that you have concern about. And that's where we get a little bit, I don't want to say nervous, but we, legitimate educational interest might be a student worker, but do we want to give them the open door to be able to be sitting in Big B and log in and look at anything that we can give them that access, potentially, because they might need to look up some students' information for their student employee work, their work, but doesn't necessarily mean we really want to open up that door. And the same goes for us. We can have that access. Do we need to be looking up our best friend's daughter's grades for her? No. Just because we have access to it doesn't mean we should be accessing it, especially regarding specific students. When in doubt, don't give it out. I think that's usually pretty safe. Again, if it's the student over the phone and they haven't been able to verify enough pieces of information with me where I feel it's the student, same thing with the parent. Usually I go through several pieces of information where the parent calls in. I go through pieces of information that they should know to be able to verify with me, so I feel confident that it's the parent and or student that I'm talking to. The more unconfident I get, the more likely, obviously, I'm not going to start that conversation. What I usually do when I'm talking on the phone, and I'm going to use the phone as an example because that's how I usually interact with students and parents, is I usually start right from the get-go with the questions. I know I can talk about non-directory level information, freely if I wanted to, but it usually, in the middle of a conversation, can cross over from directory to non-directory pretty easily in the matter of a conversation. Then you're halfway through the conversation, you're like, ugh, I just went there and I shouldn't have. So usually I say right from the get-go, let me look you up, let me verify some pieces of information with you, and then we'll go through. Unless it's a real quick generic question. If they're talking anything in regards to them where I have to look them up, I'm going to take the extra effort, verify usually 3 to 5 pieces of information with them that I feel comfortable it's a student, and then I know, okay, I'm good to go for the rest of the conversation.
More important information? Elise mentioned earlier not to leave your computer screen visible. I think that's something that we can easily do. Folks come into our offices and we were working on something, we don't put it down. If we run to the restroom, we often don't Control, Alt, Delete, and lock our computers, but we should, right? We need to be cognizant of protecting that information. Even though it's not a physical record, it's a record, and it's visible to someone who might not have the legitimate educational interest to see it. So be cognizant of that. The same with papers, of course, and I think that's an easier one to remember. Anything that's on your desk, try to keep removed if anybody else comes in. Record disposal. Of course, anything with a social security number or a campus-wide ID, a grade, or anything that is not directory information should be disposed of in the university's recycle bins. And those are the shred bins that you see around campus. And one more question. To avoid a FERPA violation, do not A, use social security number or student ID to post grades. B, leave graded test assignments in a stack for students to sort through. C, circulate a printed class list with student name and social security number ID. D, A and C, or E, all of the above. Don't use student social security number or student ID to post grades or to allow students to sort through those graded assignments. Obviously that would share non-directory information.
But yes, and that email that you get from me that I'm sure everyone just automatically deletes now would contain all of that information.
Never.
You can never say I didn't send it. And these are things that I think we've talked about throughout the presentation to avoid FERPA violations is making sure you're talking to the student, making sure you're talking about directory level information. If you're not talking to the student, you're really sharing information for those that have the legitimate educational interest, and that you're being kind of aware when you're using, and this is a Ferris Connect example, but when you're using any form, any medium, whether it's personal notes that could be shareable, Banner, Ferris Connect, MapWorks, I mean, all these things that we have student information kind of embedded in that we need to be kind of aware of. This one I in particular want to point out, because I think when a student comes to us and asks for a letter of recommendation, we say, sure, we'd be happy to. We don't think about obtaining written consent to do that. But if you're going to put anything in that letter of recommendation that would be considered non-directory level information, I mean, if you're just going to say, hey, it's a good student, I had him in a class, you're not going to list out what class it was because it's considered non-directory. If it's going to be just really general information, no big deal. If it's going to be anything that's non-directory, including the class that they were in my English 150 class, that's considered non-directory level information. It's part of their class schedule. Then you probably are going to want to get a release. Again, as specific as you can get. Hey, I'm the student. I want so-and-so to fill out a letter of recommendation. I want them to include, or they have my permission to include XYZ information. I like to point that one out because I think when the student comes to us, we think, yeah, we're good to go. We're fine filling this out. And then if you say, well, the student has a 1 point, if you start putting some information that the student's not happy about, they could potentially say, I didn't give you that permission to put my GPA in there. So again, this is just general information. I think the questions back and forth were really good. I mean, it's not clear, simple, or fun a lot of the times. I have 2 books about this size that I continually go through, and I work on it every day. And you can kind of talk yourself into circles when going through FERPA, just when you're talking about, well, there's a personal note, but I don't think it's clear, simple, or fun, like I said. But we can make it as clear and simple as fun as we can. So I think this is kind of a good general information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact. I usually am a good person to start with in the registrar's office. If I feel I'm not confident in answering the question, I'll move it up the chain, or if I feel there's been some sort of violation, I'll move it up the chain if I need be. Usually we can get it's pretty straightforward, we can get the question answered right from the start. But there are resources. There is that faculty staff reference sheet. There is obviously the registrar's office. I don't know, General Counsel, how many people call you regarding on that side?
We usually refer them to you first line.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's where I'm getting all those transfers from.
They come back to us sometimes.
Obviously, there are materials. There's print materials. There's websites that you can go to. There are lots of different resources, and we just ask people, just ask the question, because I'd rather do that and have the conversation than come to find out later there's a box of graded portfolios sitting outside someone's office that anyone could go through. So
I'm calling you on that.
So we have one more question, and it's probably the most important one of the morning.
Yes, we hope that it was clear, concise, and fun today. But please let us know. Was it beneficial? A, of course. B, not really. C, somewhat.
You could, but I think it changes.
Or D, now I love FERPA as much as Elise and Matt.
Ooh, those are both,
Good answers.
Yeah. As long as it's not B, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Any final questions? Additional information. And some of the questions and information that we got was out of this ACRO FERPA reference guide.
Thanks, you guys.
Yes,
You're
thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.